Eleanor and Adam cautiously descend a creaky staircase in the mansion's basement, holding a flashlight that casts long shadows on the cracked walls. The dim light reveals old crates, strange symbols on the walls, and a sense of growing danger. They're on edge, knowing something sinister is hidden here. Chapter 1: A Mother's Legacy. The house stood at the edge of a quiet suburban street, its white walls bathed in the warm glow of the evening sun. To Eleanor, it had never been just a house. It was a sanctuary, a place filled with echoes of laughter, whispered secrets, and the comforting scent of her mother's homemade bread. Now it was an empty shell. Eleanor ran her fingers along the wooden banister as she walked up the stairs. The silence was oppressive, pressing against her chest like a heavy weight. Her mother had passed away 3 months ago, and in that time, the house had become a museum of memories. Nothing had changed. The old armchair by the window still had a knitted blanket draped over it, and the ceramic tea set on the kitchen table remained untouched, waiting for an owner who would never return. She had spent weeks sorting through her mother's belongings, but every item felt like a thread in a tapestry she wasn't ready to unravel. The thought of moving anything felt like an act of erasure. The knock on the door made her jump. She wasn't expecting visitors. Her father had called earlier, his voice thick with something she couldn't quite place. Regret? Concern? She wasn't sure. He had been absent most of her life, only appearing when circumstances forced him to. And now, after all these years, he wanted to talk. Eleanor hesitated before pulling open the door. Her father, Robert, stood there, his sharp blue eyes surveying her with an unreadable expression. But he wasn't alone. Beside him stood a woman, blonde, impeccably dressed, with a polite but distant smile. And behind them, shifting uncomfortably, was a teenage girl with earbuds stuffed in her ears. "Eleanor," her father said, his voice calm but firm. "We need to talk." She knew in that moment that the quiet sanctuary she had cherished was about to become a battleground. Chapter 2: Unspoken Words. Eleanor stepped back wordlessly, allowing them inside, though every instinct screamed to slam the door shut. The familiar creak of the floorboards under their feet felt like an intrusion. How dare they disturb the fragile piece she'd been clinging to? Robert walked in as if he belonged, his posture stiff, betraying the tension beneath his composed exterior. The blonde woman followed, her sharp heels tapping rhythmically against the hardwood floor. The girl trailed behind, her gaze fixed on the screen of her phone, indifferent to the awkward tension. Eleanor crossed her arms, leaning against the doorway to the living room. The late afternoon light spilled through the window, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch with the silence. "So," she finally said, her voice colder than she intended. "What do you want, Dad?" Robert cleared his throat, glancing at the woman beside him. "This is Claire," he said awkwardly. "And that's her daughter, Lily." Eleanor's eyes flicked to Claire, who gave a tight smile, then to Lily, who didn't bother to look up. "I didn't come here to introduce them," Robert continued quickly. "I came because, well, your mother left something. Something important." Eleanor's heart clenched. "Like what?" "A box of old letters? A piece of jewelry?" She couldn't hide the bitterness. "Where were you when she needed you?" Robert's jaw tightened. "It's not that simple." Claire stepped forward, her voice smooth, practiced. "Your mother left a key, Eleanor, to a storage unit. She didn't tell anyone about it except Robert. And now, well, we think it might contain something valuable." Eleanor frowned. Valuable? The word felt wrong in this house, where everything of value was woven into memories, not objects. Robert reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old brass key, tarnished with age. He held it out to her, his hand slightly trembling. "She wanted you to have it," he said softly. Eleanor stared at the key. It was small, ordinary, but it carried a weight she couldn't explain. Against her better judgment, she took it, feeling its cold metal press into her palm. Lily finally spoke, pulling out one earbud. "So, what's in the storage unit?" "Gold bars? A secret treasure." She smirked, clearly amused by the drama. Eleanor didn't answer. She didn't know. But deep down, something shifted. A spark of curiosity mixed with dread. Whatever her mother had hidden, it was more than just belongings. It was a secret buried beneath years of silence. And Eleanor was about to uncover it. Chapter 3: The Storage Unit. The next morning arrived wrapped in a gray mist, the kind that blurred the edges of familiar things and made the world feel distant, almost unreal. Eleanor sat in her old pickup truck, the brass key resting on the dashboard, catching faint glimmers of the weak sunlight. She hadn't slept much. The key felt like it had burned a hole in her thoughts all night. She glanced at the crumpled note Robert had left before he and his perfect little family disappeared back to wherever people like Claire belonged. A simple address scribbled in his shaky handwriting. Storage Unit 47, Westbrook Facility. The drive was silent except for the occasional groan of the engine and the rhythmic thump of her fingers drumming against the steering wheel. Eleanor wasn't sure what unsettled her more, the mystery of the storage unit or the fact that she was actually doing this. When she arrived, the facility looked as lifeless as she felt. Rows of identical metal doors stretched out like the ribs of some giant, hollow creature. She parked, stepping out into the crisp air, key clenched tight in her fist. Unit 47 wasn't hard to find. The number was faded, the door slightly dented, as if someone had once tried to force it open. Her heart pounded, not with fear exactly, but with that strange anticipation of standing on the edge of something you can't quite name. The lock clicked open with surprising ease. Eleanor hesitated, then pulled the door up. Dust swirled in the weak light, dancing like ghosts. The space was filled with old, forgotten things. Cardboard boxes stacked haphazardly, a rusty metal trunk, and a large, covered object in the back that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. She stepped inside, her boots echoing against the cold concrete floor. She reached for the nearest box, opening it with trembling fingers. Old photographs, letters tied with fraying ribbon, a cracked porcelain figurine she vaguely remembered from childhood. Nothing that explained the secrecy, but then she saw it. The metal trunk in the corner, unlike the rest of the clutter, had a new lock. A heavy one. Someone had been here after her mother was gone. Her stomach twisted. She didn't have a key for this one. Eleanor looked around and found a rusted crowbar leaning against the wall. She gripped it tightly, her breath coming faster, and jammed it under the lock. It took several tries, the metal groaning in protest, until finally the lock snapped with a harsh clang. She lifted the lid. Inside wasn't treasure. No jewels, no stacks of money. Just a small wooden box, delicate and intricately carved. And underneath it, something wrapped in an old blanket. Eleanor picked up the box first, her fingers tracing the patterns on its surface. She opened it carefully. Inside was a stack of letters addressed to her, but they weren't from her mother. They were from her father, written over the course of 20 years. Eleanor's hands trembled as she unfolded the first letter. The handwriting was unmistakable. Her father's words spilled out, filled with apologies, regrets, and truths she was never supposed to read. And as she reached for the bundle wrapped in the blanket, her heart racing, she knew the letters were only the beginning. Whatever was hidden beneath that fabric would change everything. Chapter 4: The Hidden Truth. Eleanor sat on the cold concrete floor of the storage unit, her breath shallow, the dusty air thick around her. The letters lay scattered beside her like fallen leaves, fragile and faded with time. Her father's handwriting was so familiar, yet every word felt like reading the thoughts of a stranger. "I never meant to leave you like that, Ellie. But there were things I couldn't explain. Things I had to protect you from." His voice echoed in her mind, though she hadn't heard it in decades. He'd vanished when she was 10, just gone without a trace. Her mother had always claimed he'd died in an accident, but there'd never been a funeral, no grave, just silence. And now letters. Letters written over 20 years, hidden away. Her trembling hands reached for the bundle wrapped in the old, moth-eaten blanket. The fabric felt rough, stiff from years of neglect. She peeled it back slowly, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. Inside was a small, leather-bound journal and a gun. Eleanor stared at the pistol, her mind racing. It was old but well-maintained, tucked carefully beside the journal as if both were equally important. She wasn't sure which scared her more. She picked up the journal, its cover cracked from age, and flipped it open. The first page was dated 2 weeks before her father disappeared. "If someone finds this, I'm probably gone. But I hope it's you, Ellie. I hope you'll understand." She kept reading, the words pulling her deeper into a story she never knew existed. He wrote about a man named Victor Hale, a name she didn't recognize. Her father described him as dangerous, connected to something that sounded more like a conspiracy than real life. There were mentions of codes, missing documents, and even surveillance. They think I know where it is, but I don't. Not exactly. I just know it's hidden somewhere safe. Somewhere they'll never find it. Eleanor closed the journal, her head spinning. What was it? She glanced back at the letters, then at the gun, a chill crawling down her spine. Suddenly, a noise outside broke the silence, a soft scrape, like footsteps on gravel. Eleanor froze. She hadn't told anyone she was coming here. Shoving the letters and journal into her bag, she hesitated only a second before grabbing the gun. It felt foreign and heavy in her hand, but adrenaline steadied her grip. She moved quietly to the door, peeking through the small gap. A dark figure was moving between the rows of storage units, slow and deliberate. Not just someone passing by, someone looking for something. Or someone. Eleanor's heart raced. They knew. And they were here. Chapter 5. A shadow in the dark. Eleanor's breath hitched as she pressed her back against the cold metal wall of a storage unit. The dim light seeping through the door's edges flickered, casting shifting shadows that danced like phantoms. Her fingers tightened around the gun, the unfamiliar weight grounding her in the terrifying reality. Someone was out there, and they weren't just passing by. She dared a glance through the narrow gap again. The figure was closer now, tall, wearing dark clothes, moving with purpose. Not the hesitant, curious steps of someone lost. No, these were practiced, deliberate strides. They're looking for me. Her mind raced. She needed to get out. Staying hidden was no longer an option. She scanned the unit. A rusted metal shelf, dusty boxes, the broken chair she'd sat on earlier. Nothing useful. No back door. Just the front. She took a shaky breath, counting silently. 1, 2, 3. Eleanor shoved the door upward with a metallic screech, the sudden noise slicing through the night like a warning shot. The figure spun toward her. She didn't wait. She bolted, her footsteps pounding against the gravel as adrenaline surged through her veins. "Hey!" a voice shouted behind her. She didn't look back. Her car was parked at the far end of the lot, under the flickering glow of a dying streetlight. Too far. She'd never make it in time. Instead, she veered sharply, ducking between storage units, her shoulders scraping against the corrugated metal. She could hear the footsteps gaining on her, steady and relentless. Think. She spotted a unit with its door slightly ajar. Without hesitation, she dove inside, pulling the door down just enough to leave a sliver of space to watch. She forced her breathing to slow, straining to hear. Footsteps approached, then stopped. Silence. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, her grip on the gun slick with sweat. She could almost feel the presence outside the door, like the air itself had thickened. Then bang. The door flew upward, yanked open with brutal force. Eleanor reacted on instinct, raising the gun. But before she could fire, a strong hand knocked it aside, sending it clattering across the floor. She struggled, kicking, clawing, adrenaline-fueled panic driving her fight. "Stop!" the man barked, pinning her wrists. His face came into view, dimly lit by the outside light. A sharp jawline, dark eyes filled not with rage but something else. Desperation. "I'm not here to hurt you," he hissed. Eleanor didn't believe him. She wrenched her knee upward, catching him off guard. He stumbled back just enough for her to break free, diving for the gun. But he was fast, faster than she expected. He kicked the weapon away and lunged, grabbing her wrist again, this time holding up his other hand in surrender. "Listen," he snapped. "I'm trying to help you. Let me go." Eleanor gasped, twisting against his grip. "Not until you hear me out." His voice was low but urgent, and there was something in his eyes that made her pause. Not fear, not anger, urgency. "My name is Adam Hale," he said quickly, breathless from the struggle. "I know who you are. I know about your father." That name. Hale. Eleanor froze. Her father's journal. The name Victor Hale. "How do you," she started, but he cut her off. "Because Victor Hale was my father." Eleanor's world tilted, her fear shifting into something else. Confusion, dread, and beneath it all, the chilling realization that she was in far deeper than she'd ever imagined. Chapter 6. Threads of the Past. The words hung in the stale air of the storage unit, echoing louder in Eleanor's mind than Adam's voice had in reality. Victor Hale was my father. She stared at him, her chest heaving, her thoughts racing so fast they tangled into knots she couldn't unravel. The man's grip on her wrist loosened, as if he sensed the shift, not surrender but shock. She yanked her hand free and stumbled back, her gaze flickering between him and the gun lying just out of reach. Adam didn't move to stop her. He raised both hands in a gesture of peace, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. "I'm not here to hurt you," he repeated softer this time. His voice was rough, like gravel underfoot, but there was no menace in it. Just exhaustion. Maybe regret. Eleanor swallowed hard, her throat dry. "If you're his son, then why were you chasing me?" "I wasn't chasing you. I was trying to stop you from making the same mistake he did." She shook her head, backing toward the wall, needing the cold metal at her back to feel like something solid in this moment of unraveling reality. "I don't even know what mistake you're talking about. I don't know anything because people like you keep chasing me instead of explaining." Adam's jaw clenched. He looked down, ran a hand through his dark, sweat-damp hair, and let out a breath that sounded like frustration battling with guilt. "Your father and mine, they weren't just scientists. They were part of something bigger. A project. A program," he said. Eleanor's fingers curled into fists. "The program that got my father killed." Adam's eyes flickered with something. Recognition? Regret? She couldn't tell. "Yes," he said finally. "And it'll get you killed too if you don't listen." Silence fell between them, heavy and electric. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the thin walls of the storage unit. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, a lonely, distant cry. Eleanor's pulse slowly steadied, though her mind was anything but calm. "Start talking," she said, her voice sharper than she felt. "And don't lie to me." Adam nodded, lowering himself onto one of the dusty boxes like the weight of what he was about to say needed him to sit down. "They were working on something called Project Helix," he began. "Officially, it was about genetic research, disease resistance, human enhancement theories. But unofficially, it was about control. Biological control. They were trying to rewrite what it means to be human." Eleanor stayed standing, arms crossed tightly over her chest, like she could physically hold herself together. "My father, Victor, he believed it could change the world. But your dad? He realized too late what it really was: weaponization. Not curing people, controlling them. Your father tried to expose them. That's why he died." The words hit like a blow she wasn't prepared for, even though part of her had always suspected it. That accident had never felt right. The missing files, the way no one would give her straight answers. "But here's the thing," Adam continued, leaning forward slightly, his elbows on his knees. "They didn't kill him to silence him. They killed him because he was too close to the truth. And now, Eleanor, you're even closer." Her heart pounded again, that cold dread creeping back in. "Closer to what?" she whispered. Adam's dark eyes locked onto hers, serious and unwavering. "To the key." Eleanor's breath caught. "The key to what?" Adam stood slowly, his gaze darting to the door like he could sense something approaching. "Not what?" he said. "Who?" And before she could process the meaning of his words, the lights outside flickered, then died. A second later, the storage unit exploded in gunfire. Chapter 7. Shattered silence. The deafening roar of gunfire ripped through the fragile tension like a blade through silk. Eleanor barely had time to dive for cover, her body hitting the cold concrete floor hard as splinters of metal and dust rained down from the storage unit's thin walls. Adam was faster. In one fluid motion, he lunged for the gun lying between them, rolled behind a stack of crates, and returned fire. The sharp cracks echoed in the confined space, each shot a pulse of fear pounding through Eleanor's chest. Her mind screamed at her to move, but her body felt frozen, pinned by fear, confusion, and the overwhelming sense that everything was spiraling out of control. Adam's voice cut through the chaos. "Eleanor, move!" Adrenaline surged, shattering the paralysis. She crawled on her elbows toward the back of the unit, where a rusted service door was half hidden behind a toppled shelf. Bullets punched holes through the metal around her, each one too close, each one a reminder that death was just inches away. Adam covered her, firing with precise bursts, his face set in grim determination. When his gun clicked empty, he didn't hesitate. He vaulted over the crates, grabbed Eleanor by the arm, and yanked her to her feet. "Go!" he shouted, kicking the door open with a metallic screech. They burst into the cold night air, lungs burning, hearts racing. The sky above was bruised with dark clouds, moonlight slashing through in thin, jagged lines. No time to think. No time to ask questions. Just run. They sprinted between rows of storage units, the rhythmic slap of their footsteps drowned out by shouts and the renewed burst of gunfire behind them. Eleanor's legs burned, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but fear fueled her, pushing her beyond exhaustion. Adam led the way, cutting sharp corners, navigating the maze of metal doors with the instinct of someone who'd done this before. Eleanor stumbled, her foot catching on uneven pavement. She went down hard, scraping her hands, the impact jarring through her bones. Adam was there in an instant, hauling her up without breaking stride. "Keep going," he growled, his grip firm but not unkind. "Don't stop." They reached the edge of the complex, a chain-link fence topped with razor wire blocking their escape. Adam didn't hesitate. He pulled a compact tool from his jacket, snapped it open, and began cutting through the metal with practiced efficiency. Eleanor's heart raced faster as headlights appeared at the far end of the lot, growing larger, brighter. The attackers weren't far behind. "Hurry!" she gasped, glancing back. The fence gave way with a metallic groan. Adam shoved her through first, then followed, just as bullets sparked against the pavement where they'd stood seconds before. On the other side, they didn't stop. They ran into the darkness, through overgrown lots and abandoned streets, the city swallowing them whole. Finally, when Eleanor thought her lungs would burst, Adam pulled her into the shadows beneath an old railway bridge. He pressed her against the cold concrete, both of them gasping for breath, listening. Silence. Only the distant hum of the city remained. Eleanor's chest heaved, her mind a storm of questions, fear, and adrenaline. She turned to Adam, her voice raw and trembling. "Who are they? What do they want from me?" Adam wiped a smear of blood from his temple. Whether his or someone else's, she didn't know. His dark eyes met hers, filled with something between exhaustion and resolve. "They're the ones who killed your father," he said quietly. "And now they want you because you're the last piece of the puzzle." Eleanor's head spun. "What puzzle?" she whispered. Adam glanced at the darkness beyond the bridge, then back at her. "The one he died trying to solve." Chapter 8. The puzzle unfolds. The echo of Adam's words lingered in the cold, damp air beneath the railway bridge. Eleanor stared at him, her breath ragged, the adrenaline slowly ebbing, leaving a hollow ache in its wake. "The ones who killed your father." She didn't know which part of that sentence hit harder. The finality of her father's death, or the implication that his life had been tangled in something far more sinister than she'd ever imagined. Adam stood watch at the edge of the shadows, his sharp eyes scanning the empty streets beyond. The distant wail of sirens crept through the night, too far to be a comfort, too close to ignore. Eleanor sank to the ground, her back against the cold concrete wall, knees pulled to her chest. She could still feel the phantom sting of grazed skin on her palms, the phantom thunder of gunfire in her ears. She swallowed hard. "Start talking." Adam didn't turn around, his jaw clenched, the muscles in his face tight, as if the words tasted bitter even before he spoke them. "Your father wasn't just an engineer," he began quietly. "Not to them." Eleanor frowned. "He worked for a tech firm, systems design, encryption. I've seen his office, his projects." Adam finally looked at her, cutting her off with a sharp glance. "Exactly. Encryption. But what do you think he was really encrypting?" Her breath hitched. "He was contracted by private clients," Adam continued, his voice low. "Government agencies, corporations, even groups that don't officially exist. His last project wasn't just some algorithm. It was a key." "A key?" Eleanor echoed. Adam crouched beside her, pulling a small, battered notebook from inside his jacket. The leather was scuffed, edges worn from years of handling. He flipped it open, revealing pages filled with symbols, sketches, and numbers written in hurried, precise handwriting. She recognized it immediately. "That's my father's." Her voice trailed off, memories flooding back, nights when he'd been hunched over a similar notebook, scribbling furiously, lost in thought. Adam nodded. I found it the night he died. Eleanor's heart clenched. She reached out, her fingers brushing the familiar pages as if touching them would somehow bring her father back. What does it mean? She whispered. Adam pointed to a series of interconnected symbols, lines, circles, and strange geometric patterns. It's a cipher, but not just any cipher. It's layered, mathematical, linguistic, even symbolic. It's hiding something important. Eleanor's eyes traced the patterns, her mind racing. Despite the fear and exhaustion, a spark of recognition flickered in the depths of her memory. I've seen this before, she murmured. Adam's gaze snapped to her. Where? She struggled to piece it together. Images overlapping, her father's study, late nights filled with the soft scratch of his pen, and the old wooden box. My father had a box, she whispered. Locked. He kept it hidden in the floorboards beneath his desk. I thought it was just old papers or personal stuff, but he guarded it like it was gold. Adam's jaw tightened. Then that's where we're going. Eleanor shook her head. We can't. They'll be watching the house. Adam stood, tucking the notebook away. Then we won't go through the front door. Before she could respond, his hand was on her shoulder, steady and grounding. Eleanor, whatever's in that box, it's the reason your father's dead. And it's the reason they're after you. Her pulse quickened. The ordinary life she'd known had been shattered, replaced by shadows, secrets, and a puzzle she was now a part of, whether she liked it or not. She stood, her legs still shaky but fueled by something new, determination. Then let's find out what's inside. Adam gave a small, approving nod. As they disappeared into the night, Eleanor knew there was no going back. The puzzle was unfolding, and at its center was a truth that could change everything. Chapter 9. Into the heart of the mystery. The streets were empty, save for the occasional flicker of a street light and the distant hum of city life that seemed far removed from the danger closing in around them. Eleanor kept her head low, glancing at Adam every few seconds as they moved swiftly through the shadows. Her heart was still racing from the revelations, but the gravity of the situation was beginning to settle in. Adam's strides were purposeful, almost predatory, as if he had walked these streets many times before, knowing exactly where to go and how to avoid being seen. Eleanor felt the weight of every step, as though the walls were closing in around them. The tension between them was palpable, yet somehow, Adam's presence grounded her, reminding her she wasn't completely alone in this chaos. The old neighborhood where her father had lived was silent, every house dark, save for the faint glow from behind a curtain or two. The wind carried the scent of damp earth, mingling with the rusted scent of metal from the nearby railway tracks. Adam stopped at the edge of her father's house. The white picket fence was still standing, though time had taken its toll on the paint. The garden, once tended with care, was now overrun with weeds, and the house itself seemed to sag under the weight of its age. This is it, Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. Adam didn't speak, only nodded. They moved toward the side of the house, sticking to the shadows, keeping their movements swift and quiet. As they reached the back door, Eleanor paused. Memories flooded her. The smell of her father's pipe smoke, the warmth of the kitchen, the sound of his voice humming some old tune as he worked late into the night. A deep breath, and she pushed forward. The back door creaked slightly as she turned the handle, but it didn't resist. It was unlocked. Eleanor glanced back at Adam, who gave her a curt nod to go inside. The house was as still as a tomb, the silence stretching long into the space between them. She felt like a trespasser here, even though it was her home had been, until everything had gone wrong. The air inside smelled stale, a mixture of dust and something heavier like old secrets. The dim light from the street filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the hallway. Where's the box? Adam asked quietly, his voice a whisper that seemed to bounce off the walls. Eleanor hesitated, then led the way to the study. She stopped in front of the old wooden desk, still in the same place it had always been. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she knelt down and reached for the loose board she knew was there. Her fingers trembled as she pulled it free. Underneath, nestled in the dark space, was the box, small, nondescript, and locked. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. I never thought I'd see this again. Her voice cracked. Adam took the box from her, inspecting it closely. It had no markings, no signs of wear, It was as if it had been untouched for years, though she knew better. "Is this it?" Adam asked. Eleanor nodded. "This is it." The room felt colder now, the weight of everything pressing down. Eleanor stepped back as Adam examined the lock, his fingers working quickly. There was a click, and the lock released with a soft pop. He opened the box slowly, the hinges creaking, revealing a set of old papers and a small, neatly wrapped bundle. Adam carefully unfolded the papers, scanning them quickly. Eleanor's eyes widened as she recognized the handwriting. Her father's, but there was something different about it. The letters were hurried, almost frantic. "This," Eleanor breathed. "This doesn't make sense." Adam didn't respond immediately, his eyes scanning the pages before landing on the small bundle. He carefully unwrapped it, revealing a disc, metallic and plain, with no distinguishing features. "This is a key," Adam said. "The key to what your father was protecting." Eleanor swallowed hard, her thoughts racing. Her father had died protecting this, and now she was holding it. Whatever it was more than just a tool, it was a weapon. A noise came from behind them, a soft, almost imperceptible rustle. Eleanor froze, her heart stopping in her chest. "Someone's here," Adam muttered, his voice tense. Before she could react, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Then a voice, low, cold, and familiar. "Looking for something, Eleanor?" Eleanor spun around, her breath catching in her throat. Standing in the doorway was a man she never thought she'd see again. A man from her past, someone she had once trusted. It was Jack, her father's old partner, and he was holding a gun,